Which NFL player is under the most pressure headed into 2025? And there are a lot of ways you can look at this topic and say, oh, well, who is being thrust into the most important position? Who's getting paid the most? Who is going to be cut if they don't perform this year? Who's not going to be paid if they don't perform? And there's no real correct way of looking at things. We just compiled a list of guys who are definitely going to be feeling the heat if they do not live up to expectations headed into the year. There's some agreement here, but we really do have different opinions on what it means to be under pressure. But starting things off on someone we agree on, the clear-cut most pressure in the league right now is on Anthony Richardson. And it's plain as day. If he does not perform, it won't matter if he was the 4th overall pick, the 1st overall pick, someone they traded 12 first-rounders to go get. If he can't beat out Daniel Jones, if he is not clearly a functional to average passer of the football in the NFL, the Colts are going to move off and then probably flip the entire organization. And he's not off to a great start with that, already having a shoulder injury in training camp. I do feel bad for Richardson. He is a very small sample size. He's been banged up. Part of that's on his body outside of his control. Part of that is on his style of play. But it's undeniable. There's a lot of attention. There's a lot of pressure. There's questions of if he is going to be the long-term starter in Indianapolis. And as someone who is a physical freak, was incredibly hyped coming out the draft, it just amplifies that to a greater degree. So to me, he's got the most pressure of anyone in the league headed into the year. You may disagree on that, but he's clearly in that conversation.
Well, I think all quarterbacks and all players, there's different types of pressure heading into the season. Anthony Richardson has a lot of negative media and negative fan opinions because he took himself out of a game last season. And then there was also, he didn't play very good, and he hasn't played very good over the totality of his career. Then there's other guys like a Brock Purdy who are going to feel the pressure to live up to the contract they just signed, but aren't necessarily facing the pressure of not being a starting quarterback in the NFL 2 or 3 years from now. But when it comes to Anthony Richardson, and you have your organization bring in Daniel Jones on not an insignificant amount of money to be your backup quarterback, they draft Riley Leonard later in the draft, and now you're dealing with another shoulder injury to the same shoulder you had surgery on. If he's unable to go to start the season, and Daniel Jones is at least okay, or maybe Riley Leonard even finds his way onto the field, I think Anthony Richardson's career, it's on the ropes right now.
And we've seen quarterbacks bounce back from doing horrible on their first team. Another guy we're going to talk about later on the list, Sam Darnold. He did that. Geno Smith did that with the Seahawks. But him starting the process of rolling around is not great for a guy who has limited experience in the NFL, who desperately needs reps. He has to go insert himself on a new team and prove himself all over again. He's going to be in a rough spot, particularly if he's now the protection of being an early draft pick. Maybe Tyler Warren's the answer at quarterback. I know I've floated that idea a few times. I certainly think he's more likely to get snaps than Riley Leonard this year. But talking about...
I was just going to say, we may never see Anthony Richardson start another game if he does not, at least in the NFL in general, if he does not show some level of competency. Like, will we see another team bet on him and even bring him in on a smaller contract if he is not at least okay in 2 to 3 games this year?
Yes, undoubtedly, yes. I'll jump in on that. Someone is going to take a swing on the athleticism. Like, he is a more athletic version of Joe Milton, and the Cowboys just traded, a 5th, 6th round pick to get him on the roster. Someone will take another chance on Richardson. The question is if he's going to get a serious shot to compete for the starting job, or if he's just going to be some long-term project on the bench. But yeah, he's getting another shot. He will be on another team.
Maybe he'll be on your Vikings.
One can only hope. That is where reclamation projects go to succeed. Moving on over to a former Viking, Sam Darnold is also under a ton of pressure. I would push back on the idea a guy like Brock Purdy or Dak Prescott is under a ton of pressure because they've already been paid. They've already gotten generational wealth. They're making $55 million plus a year, and most of that is still guaranteed. They're not under that much pressure. Oh, if they don't perform, big deal. They're generationally wealthy. Sam Darnold is getting $30 million this year, and after that, if he just stinks it up, the Seahawks can cut him and save a majority of that $100 million contract. His money is not guaranteed like some of the other top-tier quarterbacks who are getting paid the big bucks. So that's why I think Darnold's under a ton of pressure. Obviously, great success in Minnesota except for the final few games and that rough spell in the middle of the season against the AFC South. But people are still waiting for him to put it together multiple years in a row. He's got one good season and 4 or 5 terrible ones. People need to see that he can be a real consistent franchise quarterback before they start believing in him. And if he can't be that, he's going to be cut and probably not get a chance to start for an NFL team ever again. He's not like Anthony Richardson. He's not an athletic freak, and he's already bounced around a little bit. This is his last shot to be a franchise guy.
Well, Sam Darnold, I don't think generational wealth is a marker for why there's pressure on him heading into the season, but I certainly think there's pressure on him when it comes to his career as a starting quarterback in the NFL. We saw the Vikings revitalize his career last year, but the circumstances were perfect. He had the best receiver in the NFL. He had one of the best wide receiver twos in the NFL in Jordan Addison. He had Kevin O'Connell calling plays for him. He had a solid running back in Aaron Jones running the ball, and he had a good defense supporting him, and that's why he was able to win a lot of games. But in the biggest moments, against the Lions, against the Rams, he lost to each of them twice and got blown out in the playoffs, getting sacked 9 times, where he put on full display his propensity to hold on to the ball too long. So I think when it comes to how he'll be talked about in the media or by fans if he struggles early, that pressure is immense. I think there's going to be a lot of media and fan pressure on him to succeed, and the circumstances are not as perfect. It is not as good of a receiver room. It's not probably as good of an offensive line, and he does not have an offensive-minded head coach or one of the best play callers in the NFL.
I would push back tremendously on the money thing not being a big motivator for pressure. Right now, if Sam Darnold doesn't perform, he stands to lose more money on this contract than he has made in the entirety of his career. That's pressure. Having $60 million disappear on you because you can't live up to the hype is a lot of pressure, particularly, and I know $30 million is a ton of money. He set himself up, sets kids up very well off, but he has not made the monster contract yet, and the $100 million threshold has not been hit. I kind of think it's a bigger deal than some people would let on. Obviously, it becomes monopoly money after a certain point, but he has not gotten that big payday. He's in line to, if he performs, he will, but right now, he is playing for it. So I do think that is an important part of the pressure. I agree with you. Shutting down the biggest moments against the Rams and the Lions, he has to play both those teams this year now, by the way, and not really knowing what he's going to be like outside of the best situation in football is a lot of pressure.
The Seahawks are paying him to be a plus starter with the type of money they've given him. So if he's unable to live up to that, and we see more of what we saw versus the Rams and Lions last year, there's going to be a lot of people slinging mud at him in the media, and the fan base is going to become fed up with him. So I think from that standpoint, there's a lot of pressure. But I think he already has generational wealth. And I get what you're saying, but it's not
There's different tiers to it. There's undeniably different tiers. So I also think he is replacing something neither of us touched on yet, a very popular quarterback in that town. Geno was loved by the Seahawks faithful. They moved off of Russell Wilson into him. They're hyping him up to be a top 8 quarterback. Very fond of Geno Smith now. Unhappy they traded him for his, a 3rd-round pick. And probably going to be unhappy if his successor doesn't come in and immediately ball out. To Darnold's credit, it seems like the Seahawks are retrofitting their roster to be more run-focused, have a better interior offensive line, be a power running team in the bitter northern territory of Washington. So that'll probably help him out a bit. Maybe not a statistical production, but it'll make it easier for him to drop back to pass if defenses are more worried about Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet than they are JSN and whoever else they've got, Cooper Kupp, to catch passes. The situation's not bad.
He's got something to prove. And to a degree, I think Jared Goff has something to prove. Now, he's established himself as a top 15 quarterback in the NFL, but when you have your offensive coordinator leave the building, when you have your defensive coordinator leave the building, when your perennial Pro Bowl center retires and you have other members of your offensive line leave the building, there is going to be pressure on you to be a stabilizing force. You're coming off one of the best seasons in Lions history with what you're able to accomplish during the regular season last year. The past 2 years have been 2 of the best years of your career. And if you are unable to lead an offense to a successful year that features Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jamison Williams still, whatever Tesla is able to offer, the rookie out of Arkansas. If you're unable to lead that team to being a top 10 offense, and then you have Ben Johnson with the Bears, turning the Bears around, and you're struggling, a lot of fans are not going to be happy with you. and the media, it's going to be a media firestorm.
You've got the right recipe, but you're using the wrong ingredients. The majority of that pressure in Detroit isn't going to fall on Jared Goff. It's going to fall on Glasnow, Mahogany, and Tate Ratledge to be the replacements on the interior of that offensive line for Ragnow and Zeitler, one of which retired, one of which moved off to Tennessee. They've lost 2 of their 4 really good offensive linemen. They're replacing them with unknown quantities in Mahogany, who played less than 100 snaps last year, and Tate Ratledge, who very promising career at Georgia, but the NFL is very different, and Glasnow, who just is not, he was clearly the worst starter on the Lions line last year. Bad snap in the playoffs against Washington. Not that guy. The pressure is on them because if Detroit's offense struggles, it's going to be because they can't effectively run the ball up the middle anymore. It's because they can't rely as heavily on David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs. It's because Goff doesn't have as much time in the pocket as he did in previous seasons. That falls on these guys before it falls on Jared Goff. The interior of the Vikings offensive line got crucified because of how badly Sam Darnold performed in the playoffs, which partially was on Darnold, sure, partially was on them for giving up those 9 sacks. 4 or 5 of those were on them. A lot of the pressure he got from the Rams the first time in the regular season on them. I think the heat is going on those guys. And Goff's under contract. Goff's fine. He'll be with the team the next few years. All these guys conceivably could be moved off of pretty easily if they do not perform. Except Ratledge, who they used the 2nd-round pick on. But even then, they drafted Miles Frazier in the 4th. They can probably shuffle him in there if Ratledge just busts entirely and have another high-level draft pick go in and play guard.
Well, when it comes to job security, certainly you are definitely right on that front. But when it comes to media pressure and fan narratives, and you have Jared Goff, who blew up in the playoffs, looked like a semblance of his regular season self, threw 3 interceptions, sub 60% completion percentage. One of those was a pick 6. If he struggles this year after losing Ben Johnson, losing members of that offensive line, do you think people are going to point the fingers at the rookie offensive guard that comes in, Tate Ratledge? Yeah, but the majority, no, that's not going to be the media or fan narrative.
I don't particularly care about the narratives. In terms of guys who are under pressure to perform, Goff's not getting replaced. Goff is keeping his job. Sure, he's going to get a lot of heat from the media, but those 3 are all essentially playing for their jobs and are going to be the reason if Detroit's offense falls off a cliff that is actually to blame. Like, I'm not going to blame Goff. He's only got 1.5 seconds in the pocket each play because the defensive tackle's breathing down his neck. I'm not going to blame him for not being able to consistently perform on 3rd and long because the running game can't really do anything on 1st or 2nd down. Like, we have different views of pressure. Like, these guys need to perform in order for the Lions' offense to be successful. I assume Goff will perform. These guys are an unknown quantity. They're replacing great players already. They're not established, which to me is why they're under pressure.
Well, you can make the argument that practice squad players who have made no money in NFL terms are under the most pressure then.
All right, we can do that then. How many practice squad players are going in and replacing All-Pro Hall of Fame level players?
Not a lot.
Not a lot, exactly. It would behoove us to learn those guys' names so we can add undue hatred to their already considerable plate of challenges. We at Thicc Minic aspire to be the greatest haters.
And I think another member of the Lions that is under a lot of pressure is Aidan Hutchinson. Some of it not his fault. Another element of it is the fact that he's coming off a major injury last year. He was a Defensive Player of the Year candidate before he broke his leg. And there's been some people memeing on him because of the leg sleeve. But when you're coming off that major injury, you were playing so well before of it, there's going to be some level of expectation to at least play close to that level in 2025. And then there's the added element. You lost Aaron Glenn as your defensive coordinator. The Lions did not really do much to pair you with another star pass rusher that can play opposite side of you. They expect you to be elite and healthy game 1 right away. So I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on Aidan Hutchinson in his contract year to be what he was before he got hurt last year and play good coming off that injury.
I mean, I guess I can agree with that to a certain extent. I don't see Detroit moving off him or even not giving him a massive contract if he doesn't perform at that high of a level. He was a great run defender, so I don't think that's going to change. A lot of that was effort. A lot of that was knowledge and technical skill. Even if he's injured and a little bit less explosive, that's not going away. As for the pass rush upside, yeah, they could stand to have somebody else next to him besides DJ Reader on the inside caving the pocket in, or the 3 games of Marcus Davenport they get each season. But I just don't see him losing that much money, or his job, certainly not if he underachieves this year. I don't think he's under that much pressure. I think people realize, hey, he's coming off a major injury. Maybe the numbers, particularly in the first 8 games, are not going to be spectacular. Like, he's got the built-in excuse already that a lot of these other guys don't.
Yeah, and when it comes to the amount of money he'll make, if he's at least a solid starter, given what he's shown before his injury, he'll probably still get somewhere close to that Myles Garrett money. But if he falters a little bit or gets banged up again, then maybe the Lions have some more negotiating wiggle room to not give him a contract that's approaching that $40 million a year.
I don't think they want to hardball one of their franchise's best players. I really don't, particularly a hometown guy like Hutch. But somebody who does not have that built-up credibility with their team is George Pickens, who the Dallas Cowboys just traded for. And there really is no more excuse for him. He has to be maybe not a true number 1, but at least a very high-level number 2. A guy out of the Jalen Waddle, Devontae Smith mold. Because now, great quarterback. At the very least, a great passer of the football. Very good offensive line. Presumably, we like the moves they made in the offseason. CeeDee Lamb is taking cornerback 1 attention. He's in a much different situation, a much better situation than he was in Pittsburgh, and is going to be in a contract year for the Cowboys. So he's both got to perform and got to stop picking fights with every single cornerback he runs into on the field, because Pittsburgh was a big market, sure, or at the very least got a lot of media attention, but the Cowboys have a more nationally televised game than anyone else in the league. If he is constantly fighting with opposing cornerbacks, he's going to get more heavily scrutinized, more heavily fined, probably going to get suspended if it becomes a habit, does it 2-3 times in a year. He's under a lot of pressure on the Cowboys.
Well, I agree. I mean, the Chiefs have more nationally televised games, but that's besides the point.
That's because they play on Tuesday, they play on the leap year, they play on Friday the 13th somehow. The Chiefs play on weird times.
Regardless, from the standpoint of George Pickens being able to be that number 1 or 1B receiver for a team, whether the Cowboys are the ones that give him the money or some other team sees what he does on the Cowboys this season and they're the ones to give him the big contract, there is pressure on him. Because if he does not perform, or if he has those antics and he's only a 700, 800 yard receiver, or even if he approaches 1,000, but it is not done in a way where you're given confidence that he's going to be a perennial Pro Bowler, challenging CeeDee Lamb for targets in the offense, there's pressure on him. He's got money to lose. He's got a lot of money to make. I don't know if he'll exactly be a Cowboy long term, because they don't always pay guys they did not draft. It tends to be more of the CeeDee Lambs, Dak Prescott's. Micah Parsons still needs a contract. So there's going to be a lot of money on their books elsewhere, but he's got a lot of money he can potentially make this season.
I don't think that's ever going to be a real factor in Dallas. Obviously, CeeDee Lamb, top 3, top 4 receiver. Maybe if you're really crazy, top 1. But we mostly agree on that. We agree he's under a ton of pressure. I'd like to stick with the Cowboys briefly, and I don't mean to do 2 in a row. I think Mazi Smith is also worth talking about. First-round draft pick, played terrible as a rookie, played terrible for a majority of 2024. Had a few games in the back half of the season where he looked decent as a starter. If he doesn't perform this year, at least at an average level, he's getting cut. There's no 2 ways about it, and I don't think he's going to get picked up by anyone else again. Like, Mazi Smith is playing for his NFL life.
Well, we've seen players get picked up and have depth roles on defensive lines, but when it comes to making any significant amount of money, or not that he's necessarily was ever going to be a high-level starting defensive tackle in the NFL.
He was a first-round pick on an interior guy. You expect him to be a high-level player.
You expect him to at least be elite run stopper, which he was drafted for, and he hasn't shown any semblance of that.
And part of that's on him, and part of that's on the Cowboys, because they really are the worst rushing defense in the NFL, and that's not just because they got weak interior defensive line play. It takes everybody. It takes everybody to be a good run defense, not just the interior defensive linemen, but the superstar defensive ends, the cornerbacks who break the NFL record for the most pick sixes in the season, and they've really let him down. But it starts with him. It starts with the interior defensive lineman, and Smith has just failed at that so far. So he's under a ton of pressure.
I can see where you're coming from, but when it comes to guys like that who have been later first-round picks underperforming, there's a lot of those guys. There's a lot of early second-round picks, late first-round picks that just quite haven't lived up to what their team, what role the team that drafted them wanted them to fill.
Yeah, but those guys both aren't playing for America's team and also are not getting as many reps as Mazi Smith is, who is still playing.
Well, the Chiefs are America's team now.
No,
but we don't need to start that debate.
Unfortunately, the team who's America's team has a trademark, so bad news, Kansas City.
So we're moving on to some positional players, and one that I think has a lot of pressure on him is Kyle Pitts. Over the last few seasons, he has kind of been a fantasy football darling. He's been a top 10 tight end off the board in fantasy drafts. He's heading into a contract year. There are some rumors that he didn't show up to all Falcons activities because he wants a new contract, but I don't really see how he could expect that when he's due, I think, $9 million this season. That's about what you're going to get. Probably less if you're Kyle Pitts on the open market. So I think there's pressure on him to perform if he wants to get paid. Fantasy, when it comes to a fantasy football perspective, how fans view him, he's now the 18th tight end off the board. So people are low on him in general. He's in a contract year. If he wants to get paid, he can't be missing team activities like he has been so far. So I think it is going to be an interesting 2025 for him.
Of course, when we talk about Kyle Pitts, we've got to bring up the fantasy side of things. Who has expectations for Kyle Pitts right now? What pressure is he on? Obviously, he's going to get the new contract. You say, okay, that's a deal. He's going to get picked up by somebody. He's not going to wash out the NFL. And he's clearly not going to have a superstar breakout season and earn record-breaking money for a tight end. Like, I don't know if there's a ton of expectations on him. Therefore, I don't know if there's really that much pressure on him. He's a player who's not going to be out of the league, but is also not going to be paid. And there's nothing this year, barring horrible injury or 12,000 yards or 1,200 yards and 20 touchdowns can do to change that. We know who Kyle Pitts is. Kyle Pitts is a known commodity.
You're telling me if Kyle Pitts had 1,200 yards and actually proved to be able to score touchdowns with Michael Penix throwing in passes, the Falcons wouldn't pay him or someone else wouldn't pay him?
What player who catches passes could you say that about and have it not be true?
This is true, but
like
there's a lot.
Every player has a capacity comparable to Kyle Pitts, it feels like.
Yeah, but we're talking about a tight end that's on the last year of his deal that is making money that's good for a tight end. Where if he continues to produce,
overall pick,
where he continues to produce at the level he has been, he's going to be making less than that, potentially in a smaller role in an offense, and he's not going to make potentially double the salary he's currently making.
I think you are using it like. You could say, sure, yeah, I get that. It's a valid argument, except you could use that for every player going into their fifth-year option who hasn't really performed up to the hype. The only reason we're having this conversation about Kyle Pitts is because he had 1,000 yards as a rookie, and a bunch of fantasy people labeled him the greatest tight end of all time. That is the only reason this is a conversation, and really, it's not a conversation anymore. No one has any expectations for Kyle Pitts except Kyle Pitts and his camp.
But there's still pressure on. You've been talking about the monetary pressure.
Way more pressure. He stands to either double his salary or see a slight reduction. I'm talking about guys who could miss out on tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. And Kyle Pitts doesn't have the capacity to go out there and earn that.
So you think he's just resigned to making less money because he sucks?
I think he's just mid. I think everyone besides him knows he's mid.
Okay.
Everyone besides his agent knows he's mid. And he will be treated as such by the NFL community. On to Bryce Huff, who's in an interesting spot. Eagles paid him a ton of money. Barely played is not the right term. Was not a key contributor on the Super Bowl team. And now has been traded for a third-round pick to the San Francisco 49ers to kind of replenish the defense, which was raided in the offseason in free agency. If he doesn't perform, he's going to get cut, and he's never going to make that big money again. He may be out of the NFL because if you can't cut it in Philadelphia or San Francisco, two of the best-run organizations, best coach teams in the league, where can you cut it? I guess the Panthers or someone like that could sign him for a 1-year, $7 million contract. But if Huff doesn't perform, which I have no real strong expectations for him to, but the money is already in place for him to, he's going to be in big trouble. He's going to start rolling. If Huff does perform, is able to pair well with Nick Bosa as a real 1-2 punch, then we get back into that conversation like, okay, is this a dynamic tandem? Is this guy worth another contract once the current 3-year one is up? It's an interesting spot. I have a hard time understanding why he failed in Philadelphia and why he'd suddenly succeed in San Francisco. Maybe I'm missing something.
Well, I kind of disagree that there's a ton of pressure on him because he's going back to a situation where he's played for Saleh before. There's a reason they traded for him because Saleh knows how to use him from a pass rushing perspective, from probably a rotational perspective, the best situations to put Bryce Huff in to make the 49ers defense successful and Bryce Huff successful. So I don't think there's as much pressure on him as there is any other guy who maybe has been traded or had a down year in 2024.
Getting paid, having a down year, and getting traded to a new spot is not the same as having a down year in 2024. And going to a good situation hasn't precluded us from criticizing any of these quarterbacks. Like Anthony Richardson's in a good spot. Sam Darnold's in a good spot. We'll talk about some of the year 2 guys later. They're in good spots. I don't think being in a good spot necessarily alleviates pressure. In fact, if you underperform in this spot, you're in trouble. You can say, oh, he's less likely to underperform in San Francisco than he is anywhere else. But I don't know. I just don't. Also think the 49ers defensive line is not quite as good as the Jets defensive line was when they had him.
Well, you gave up, he's been paid already. You gave up a not insignificant pick to bring him to your team. Your defensive coordinator has coached him before. So I just don't think
You think it's a good situation?
I don't think there's an immense amount of pressure on him.
He can get the rest of his contract voided if he's cut. The pressure is there to establish himself as more than just some guy, to be a legitimate NFL Pro Bowl level player for a long time. If he doesn't do it this year, he's not going to do it. The door is open, he's just got to walk through it.
Now, a guy that I think has a good amount of pressure on him, we've seen him have a few successful seasons. Last year was a major down year, is Travis Etienne. His first year starting as the Jaguars running back, wildly successful. Over 5 yards a carry, 300 receiving yards. The year after that, a lot more inefficient, 3.8 yards per carry, but had a lot of rushing attempts, so still got over that 1,000-yard mark. Had over 400 receiving yards, and last year, major down year. Only 500 rushing yards, 3.7 yards per carry. Didn't do as much in the receiving game. And you had Tank Bigsby come in and be the more explosive, more productive running back for that Jaguars offense. So he's in a contract year. There's a younger player who has been more healthy over the course of his own career, be better than you last season. He's still on the roster. Trevor Lawrence is healthy. Elite running backs may not be a dime a dozen, but middle of the pack running backs certainly are. And there's going to be pressure on Etienne if he wants to get paid moving forward.
I think you're a year late with this video, and it wasn't really under that much pressure because we didn't know the full situation. I think he's already lost the starting job. I think that ship has sailed. I think Tank Bigsby is better than him, and once a running back kind of is a little bit diminished physically, isn't reading the whole as accurately, staying on the same team, being a backup isn't a recipe to get them back into fighting form. I think Bigsby's the guy in Jacksonville, and there's only so much pressure I can ascribe to you if you're a backup running back like Travis Etienne will be. It's going to be somewhat of a 1-2 punch. Sure, it's not just going to be Bigsby gets 15 carries a game, Etienne gets 5. It'll be closer to a 50-50 split. I already think he has lost that battle. And if we're going to say, oh, well, he's in a contract year, that being different, I think Bigsby's kind of under the same thing because he does not have the fifth-year option, is not a first-round pick. He's somewhat of a limited athlete, feels like an insulting term, but he's an undersized guy who's not super quick. If he loses out on this battle, if Etienne suddenly starts taking his snaps, it flips back to him getting 15 carries while Bigsby only gets 5 a game, he's going to get cut or he's going to get sent down to the practice squad. So I think both of them are under a similar amount of pressure. If you want to give it a little bit more to Etienne because he's in a contract year, sure, but I also already think he's lost the job.
Well, Etienne has more to lose compared to Tank Bigsby, in my opinion. And I think when we look, you said he's already lost a job or it's already a 50-50 split. We've seen teams with running backs, if one is significantly outproducing the other, they'll abandon the 50-50 split quite early. I mean, with Tyrone Tracy and Devin Singletary last season, the Giants gave Devin Singletary some money to be a contributing member of their backfield. But as soon as they realized Tyrone Tracy was the significantly more explosive and the more dynamic running back and what he was able to offer the offense, we saw Devin Singletary's touches disappear. So I think the same could be said for the Jaguars offense.
Okay, how often do we see that scenario which you just described play out, then the running back who just got their job taken come back the next season and reinsert themselves in the offense? It's already over for Etienne. Like, it's Bigsby's role.
We don't know what his offseason will look like. We don't.
Is he showing up in both the best shape of his life, bigger and stronger than he's ever been, but also lighter and quicker than he's ever been? Are we going to go with that?
He could be.
All right, big dog. Dan Moore, keeping it in the AFC South, is an interesting case. Because on one hand, he got paid a bunch of money, 4 years, $82 million. On the other hand, he gave up the most sacks in football last year. I have pounded, well, we don't have a desk anymore. I have pounded the floor and said it's not his fault. Being the blindside protector for Justin Fields and Russell Wilson in a single season is a tackle's nightmare. Those guys sack themselves an awful lot, but he's getting paid top tier tackle money. The expectation is he is not going to get up the most sacks in football again. He's not going to be a liability in the pass game, and he is protecting the franchise. He is protecting Cam Ward back there. So I think Dan Moore can be traded, cut, lose out on a ton of money if he doesn't perform at least close to the billing he's getting paid.
I'd imagine there are probably going to be fraud narratives thrown out there if we see Cam Ward getting sacked a ton, and a lot of those sacks coming from Dan Moore's side. So I can see when it comes to the Titans fan base, there being a lot of pressure on Dan Moore because, like you said, if he's not at least an average starter and their young quarterback's getting sacked a lot, you may get your house egged and your tires slashed.
Potentially. They've also got Zeidler, Skoronski at guard. Supposedly their center's pretty good according to Titans fans, but every team is a good center according to their fans. And J.C. Latham was pretty solid on the back half of 2024. Admittedly, he's going to get moved over to the right side unless they're playing more that much to be the right side tackle, which, I don't know. So if there's an area of weakness on the O-line, I kind of think it's the guy that just paid $82 million. But
we mentioned Ben Johnson earlier. He's maybe a coach who's under pressure, but a direct result of Ben Johnson being under pressure is Caleb Williams being under pressure. He did not live up to the extremely lofty expectations people like myself and others set for him prior to the season. I think after the fact, hindsight being 2020, the situation was not as great as it was chalked up to be. But when you're heading into a new year with a head coach that is highly touted when it comes to his play calling and offensive genius, if you want to call it that, and you bring in Colston Loveland in the draft, you bring in another receiver in Luther Burden, you have DeAndre Swift, who was successful last year, you completely retool the offensive line, the pieces are in place now. Everything that we can look back on his rookie season and give him excuses for, the Bears have made an effort to address. So there is going to be a lot of pressure on Caleb Williams to at least have close to a top 10 offense in the NFL. If they don't get to around that range in offensive production, there's going to be a lot of people talking very negatively about Caleb Williams and also Ben Johnson as a result.
Yeah, bringing in Drew Dalman and Joe Thuney in one offseason just completely flips the interior offensive line. Joe Thuney is one of the few interior offensive linemen I think the casual fan would at least know the name of. And Joe Jackson, I'm not high on him, but he's certainly better than what they had. With someone who is the hottest commodity in the coaching market, paired with that new O-line, who just had a ton of success with your division rival, yeah, the expectations are really high. And we'll talk about J.J. McCarthy here in a second. I think he's essentially a rookie, so the expectations are not going to be as bad for him, and he was not as hyped coming out of college. But if J.J. McCarthy in your own division comes in and succeeds due to the spot he's in or due to his own individual skill, then the pressure is really going to be on, because you'll then have the fourth best quarterback in the division who you just spent a first round pick on, who you just retroactively, or who you just jerry-rigged your offense to have succeed, who brought in the phenom coach of the day to help guide with a gazillion different offensive weapons, all of substantial quality. Like, what? There is no more excuse. Caleb Williams has to perform. JJ at least has the built-in excuse of it's his first year as a starter. He's going to get a lot of heat if the Vikings start slow, if they struggle at any point, if they don't win 13 games, they don't live up to the hype that last season was. And I understand that, but Minnesota is also a small media market, which is something else McCarthy can hide behind. People do not want to talk about the Vikings generally. They would much rather talk about Chicago.
Yeah, there's a different element in place for J.J. McCarthy when it comes to pressure, because the Vikings are coming off of a 14-win season?
14-win season.
So they're coming off of that. They got rid of that quarterback because they think J.J. McCarthy can elevate their offense and take them to a new level and at least be close to that win total, be a high-end playoff team. So that is a level of pressure that I think J.J. McCarthy has. There's been an expectation set with the pieces the Vikings have on this offense to be that quality of team. With the Bears, there is some level of grace that is going to be given when it comes to building kind of from the ground up with a new head coach. I don't think the Bears are going to get as much hate if they only win 8, 9, 10 games. But
it
Caleb Williams looks really
those 8, 9, 10 games.
That'd be exactly my point. Where if the Vikings only are winning around those games and J.J. McCarthy struggles, it's going to kind of be like, maybe we would have been better off with Sam Darnold. So I think there's a different level of pressure from that perspective. But I also do agree with you. JJ McCarthy has the built-in excuse of it being his first year as a starter. If Caleb Williams shows many of the same weaknesses that he did in his rookie year, does not show an improvement with his propensity to hold on to the ball too long, a propensity to play hero ball, there's going to be a larger sample size of poor decision making where more doubt creeps into everyone's head as to whether or not he can be a top 15 high quality starter in the NFL.
He's got to be better than a top 15 guy. He was getting Trevor Lawrence and Andrew Luck levels of hype. And you can say what you want about Trevor Lawrence and him not living up to that hype either, but Caleb Williams has to be approaching top 10 this season. He's got to be in the conversation of guys like Geno Smith, Jared Goff. Baker Mayfield might be a bit too lofty just because no one really stuffs the stat sheet like Baker does these days, although he's probably coming back down to earth in 2025. But he's got to be close. With how he's built as, top 15 is not acceptable. With how good this offense is, top 15 is not acceptable. And that's unfair for a rookie, but going into year 2, I think it's a reasonable ask.
If you can have a top 15 quarterback, there's a chance you will be in the playoffs or competing for a Super Bowl. So I think that's, but my major point is, regardless of where you want to set that bar of success, if he shows many of the same weaknesses, there is much more doubt in your head that he's going to be able to reach whatever that bar you set for him is.
Looking at McCarthy one last time, I think he's in a better setting to succeed. I think he gets the grace people being able to actually watch the games, particularly Sam Darnold's final 2, and saying, okay, as long as JJ is not sacking himself 10 times over a 2-game stretch, he's probably an upgrade. As long as he's able to throw over the middle of the field with somewhat consistent accuracy, with some control of the ball, it's not as bad as Sam Darnold was. And he's a year younger than Caleb Williams. He's got lower expectations, under less pressure, even though the system's better. Williams, we start talking about, okay, do we move off Ben Johnson? Do we let him have another year? Does Williams get replaced if we get That's the real question. The Bears have a top 5 pick. Do they trade up for Arch Manning?
The only way that JJ McCarthy could conceivably be like the future of his career could go completely down the tube, which I don't think he's this bad.
Yeah, it's if that big horn falls off the top of Viking Stadium and crushes him.
It's like, what if he is like a Josh Rosen type season, or maybe he gets hurt and the Vikings everything goes
trade
wrong
for Aaron Rodgers,
and then they're in position to draft another rookie who is extremely successful in college next year. That's the only way you could say there's like JJ McCarthy's future is uncertain in Minnesota.
I'm good on Lenore Sellers, man. I got JJ.
Arch Manning, Lenore Sellers.
I don't think Arch is coming out.
Drew Aller.
I'm good on Drew Aller. I think most people who've watched Drew Aller are good on Drew Aller. But Drew Aller hate aside,
that has been our players we think are under the most pressure heading into the 2025 NFL season. Let us know if you think there's anyone we missed or did not address. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.